We're recording.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to call to order the Green Bay Housing Authority meeting for Wednesday, May 16th. And we'll start with roll call. I think we've got that in the record. So we'll move right on to approval of the agenda. Item B. You've got the agenda before you, plus your packet. Is there a motion to approve the agenda? And I would jump in, one change. If you look at item, in section D, it would be moving the item number 3 in section D up to item number 1. Just move that up and shuffle everything else back down. So that would be my recommendation for the agenda. We have some folks here from HUD, and we'd like to get them, have them make their presentation so they don't have to stay.
You need a motion to vote on it, or we?
Yeah, I need a motion to approve.
I'd make a motion to approve.
We have a motion to approve the agenda and its amendment, and a second. Any discussion or questions? Otherwise, hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. So then we move on to the approval of the minutes from the April 11th meeting. Those are in your packets. Any additions or corrections? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
Make that motion to.
And I will second it. All, again, any questions, changes, additions, modifications? Otherwise, hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, so now we move on to D, regular business, and we'll do the amended version of this with a rental assistance, a RAD demonstration from our folks from HUD. So Scott, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, hi. So, my name is Scott Kegler. I'm the Portfolio Management Specialist in the Milwaukee Field Office with HUD. And so essentially the Portfolio Management Specialists are the key people in the public housing program at HUD that work directly with the housing authorities. Each of us have like a specific portfolio of housing authorities that we work with, and Green Bay Housing Authority is in my portfolio, so I work pretty closely with Jamie and with Cheryl on just the HUD oversight. And so previous to this meeting, I went through a pretty detailed presentation with the Housing Authority and the board chair, talking about some of the repositioning options. I'm not going to go through the full presentation again for the meeting because it can take about an hour and a half, and I want to make it pretty concise. But essentially, I'm going to look at different options that are available under some new authorities that came out for Green Bay Housing Authority to be able to reposition. So essentially, that means moving from the current public housing platform into a different platform. Most likely, it would be Section 8. And the advantages to that is it allows you, under some options, to get additional revenue. And under all of these options, it opens up the ability for debt financing. Because right now in the public housing, there's a trust agreement that's on the property that restricts the ability of the housing authority to get debt financing. And it becomes a real impediment to looking at long-term capital needs, specifically with Mason Manor. And so over the last, say 8 years or so, between both the RAD program, that rental assistance demonstration, and new authorities that are under what's called the Section 18 demolition, disposition, removal, it provides a lot more options for the housing authority to look at repositioning. So first, I'm not going to go through all the slides, so you'll see me kind of bump by them. There are extra copies of the presentation so you can see all the slides, and Bill can fill you in on stuff if there's a slide that really looks interesting for you. But I'm just going to pop up to some of the key ones. And so this is the first one. So what are the options? So essentially on the left-hand side, Section 9 is public housing. So we don't typically refer to it as Section 9. You hear Section 8 all the time, and they talk about, well, including HUD, talk about the Housing Choice Voucher Program being like the Section 8 program. Well, public housing is actually Section 9. And so we typically call it public housing, but Section 9 public housing is the technical term. And you do have some options for financing under Section 9, and so that's on the left-hand side. There's mixed finance, which essentially allows some debt financing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But then you can also do like operating fund and capital fund financing. Essentially what you're doing is you're promising future revenues from the federal government as security for loans. Typically those really come into play when you're talking emergency repairs, because you're using those funds right now for your existing needs, and if you take if you say in the future, we're not going to use those for operating anymore, we're going to use this for debt service, you got to figure out, well, how do I meet our operating costs? Because essentially you're stealing from Paul to pay Peter under that. So it's an option that's available, but it's typically, only available for specific reasons. And then there's also like energy performance, which allows, again, energy performance, if you're looking to finance energy improvements, that's a really good way to do it. But it's kind of limited. When you go over to the repositioning options, you've got, Section 32 home ownership. So that would be something you could do with your single-family scattered site properties, where essentially you allow the current residents to purchase those properties. There's a rental assistance demonstration. That's, again, I'm going to spend more time on that. And then there's that Section 18 demolition and disposition. And so whenever, just as an aside, whenever you hear me say section whatever, so that means that's part of the Housing Act in 1937, and that's that section of that act. So Section 18 is Section 18 of the Housing Act of 1937. That also means it's statute. So that means Congress is the only one that can change it. So it's not something that changes that often. Rental assistance demonstration, on the other hand, is more of a regulatory change where we're allowed some discretion on how to do repositioning under that category. And then the last thing is a voluntary conversion, Section 22. And I'll talk very briefly about that, but as we mentioned in the meeting earlier with Bill, it's probably not a good option because it has some restrictions. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these slides, but this is an important one. So the biggest difference between doing a RAD conversion and doing a Section 18 conversion is in the end result and how much revenue you earn. And so this chart shows that, and unfortunately the title fell off when I copied this over, but this should say Section 9 over here. So under Section 9 public housing, this bar chart on the left is how you currently are funded. So the funding is based off, it's like a three-legged stool. And so we always use what's called a per unit month calculation. So basically it takes all the funding and assumes that it's evenly applied to every unit in the property. And so we come up with that per unit month. It's kind of a calculated value, but it allows us to do apples to apples comparisons when we're looking at different projects and different programs. And so in this example, this housing authority, their per unit monthly total is $792 for each of their public housing units. And that $792 per month is divided up in tenant rent comes in at $318. So again, tenants do pay rent, and it's typically based at 30% of their income. So in this case, they're making about $300 on that. Of the capital fund that comes in, $144 is allocated to each unit, and then operating fund is allocated at about $330 each unit. So they earn $792 per unit. If this housing authority converted to RAD, so they got a Section 8 contract, either a project-based voucher contract or a project-based rental assistance, and I'm not going to go in depth on the differences on that, but basically they're both under the Section 8 program. They still get the same amount of money. So your revenue stays neutral in that conversion. You still earn about $792 per unit, but the way the payment comes in changes dramatically. You still get the $318 from tenant rent. Tenants are still paying rent based on 30% of their income. However, now instead of getting operating fund and capital fund, you just get a housing assistance payment for in this case, it's about $475 per month. And the reason that's different is, as Cheryl and Stephanie can attest, operating fund and capital fund have lots of strings. You can only spend them for specific things, and you can only spend them, you have to spend them in specific time frames, and there's lots and lots of reporting that comes in order to show that you're following the HUD required uses of those funds. And the Section 8 with a housing assistance payment, you have a HAP contract, a housing assistance payment contract with either HUD or the housing agency that runs the voucher program, because again, if you go PVRA or PVV, that's your obligation. Your obligation under a HAP contract is I will provide this participant housing for the month of June. And in exchange for that, you will give me $474. Once you have provided housing for the month of June for that participant, you get your $474, and it's the housing authority's money. You can allocate how you want to use all of that revenue coming in on the HAP contract in any way you want. Of course, you're a housing authority organized under state law, so you still have to follow those government rules. But unlike operating capital fund, where there's all kinds of additional reporting and strings on how you spend it, once this comes in on the housing assistance payment, it's your money to spend how you want. So essentially, the benefit of going RAD is it removes all of the Section 9 reporting and administrative requirements, which are extensive. There's reasons for them. I'm from HUD, and I'm not going to say that they're bad rules, but they are extensive. There are many things that you have to report, and most of those administrative requirements go away. Not all, but a vast majority of them go away when you go RAD. That's the advantage of RAD. But the key to remember is essentially your funding stays the same. So that's RAD. So the other option we talked about was Section 18, and again, I'm jumping forward. And so Section 18, it's a Section 18 of the Housing Act of 1937. And essentially, what Section 18 allows you to do is to remove housing from the public housing program. And you can either convert it to something else, or you can just straight out remove it. But under authorities that come under the new notice that was issued last year, 2018-4, we're using the Section 18 removal, either disposition or demolition regulations in order to do development and essentially repositioning of housing. So instead of just saying we're going to take this housing out and it's just going to go away and nothing's going to be on it, you're actually using the Section 18 rule to move it over to a Section 8 project-based voucher contract. And so because you're moving out of public housing, you know, it's, again, all of those administrative functions go away. Now, there's still restrictions on Section 18. So Section 18 used to be very, very difficult to do. You used to have to meet a very high cost burden on the physical and capital needs of the projects that you wanted to remove. And I won't go into the specific details on it, but essentially it was a bar that was very difficult to get over. And it was done on purpose because when Section 18 was first written into the law, and it was in the law almost from the start in 1937, the idea was we were trying to preserve affordable housing, so we didn't want housing authorities to make it really easy to take units out of public housing. But now with these adjustments to Section 18 under this 2018 notice, we're making it easier because the idea is this is not housing that's going away permanently, it's just housing that's going from Section 9 to Section 8.
Well, and Scott, just to,
Yes.
I think before to clarify, our scattered site units are not owned by the Green Bay Housing Authority. They're in what's called the Declaration of Trust with the federal government. So the federal government owns the properties, we manage them and receive the subsidy. So when he's talking about like removal, it's really kind of removing them from that trust agreement
Yes.
with the federal government.
Yeah, so it's, thank you very much, Sharon, that's good. So it's taken it out of the Section 9, but more importantly for you is, like, when you're talking, the reason that it's difficult to address capital needs through debt financing in Section 9 is the Housing Authority doesn't own the properties. You don't own your scattered site units, and you don't own Mason Manor. There's a declaration of trust filed on that, and essentially what that says is you are managing and operating that housing in trust for the federal government in order to provide affordable housing in the city of Green Bay. But the flip side of that is if you go to, Fox Valley Savings Bank and say, hey, I need to get $1 million to fix my boiler, they're going to be like, okay, great, we'll give you a mortgage and we're going to put a lien on the property, and you're going to be like, well, we don't own the property. Well, if you don't own the property, we're not going to give you a mortgage. So it really restricts the funding that you get. Now, there are some programs you can go in that work, and I'll talk about it in a future slide, like mixed finance, that allows you to do some debt financing on public housing, but you really have narrow options. So that's one of the big ideas with this, is it allows you to transition to a platform where potentially you earn higher revenue, and two, it makes it much easier to do that debt financing for capital needs. And so with Section 18, one of the ideas, or one of the avenues that I think is really advantageous for City of Green Bay is the 50 units, or excuse me, the scattered sites. So before there used to be this well, that's not before, it's still there, but this cost barrier that you had to get over. But now one of the flexibilities in Section 18 removal is if you have scattered sites, and your scattered site unit does meet the definition of scattered site for this, that's the barrier. If you can show, hey, I've got scattered sites, you can take your 48 to 50 units of scattered site through a Section 18 removal right now. You already meet the hurdle that you have to go over. So if you wanted to do the Section 18 for the scattered sites, that's very easy for you to do. There's some other ones that don't really apply to Green Bay, so I'm not going to go through them in detail, but really the other option is the physical obsolescence. So that's still an option, and that could be something to look at for Mason Manor, as I'll talk about in a future slide. But it's, like I said, it's on purpose a pretty high barrier to hit. So it's something to be aware of. Voluntary conversion, I'm just going to briefly mention this. So voluntary conversion is basically, that's like you want to cut ties, you're done, I just want to go away. I don't want to be in public housing anymore, I don't want to have to deal with HUD anymore, that allows you to go through a voluntary conversion. You can do a streamlined voluntary conversion if you have 250 units or less, which Green Bay does. I think you've, 202 is your number? 204? 202 because of the two we removed. So this is an option, but as we discussed earlier, I don't think it's a good option for two reasons. One is you have to close out your program, and that actually is going to prevent you from earning some future funds, as I'll talk about in a minute. So under a streamlined voluntary conversion, you basically remove the ability to earn some future funding streams. And the second point, it's very important, is you can still get vouchers, but they're not project-based vouchers. So that means if you took your 202, 204 units out through a streamlined conversion, all of your residents are going to get vouchers, but if they decide they're going to move to Phoenix, you no longer have subsidy on your unit. So it makes it very difficult for you to sustain your units if you go a streamlined voluntary conversion. So it's not really a good option when we're talking about trying to figure out ways to meet the capital needs of both Mason Manor and your scattered sites. So again, that just talks about the different tools. And so I just want to briefly go over this. Part of the reason on why we're talking a lot about repositioning is historically HUD has underfunded capital needs of public housing. I'm sure that is not news to any of you. But when you look at the long-term funding trends, you can just see that even the long-term funding trends are not good. So the green line is your operating fund. So operating funds are funds from HUD in order to meet basically your operating expenses, paying salaries, insurance, those type of things. The blue line is capital fund. Capital fund is like it says, it's for the long-term capital needs of your property. And as you can see from both of those trend lines, they are going down. Now operating fund is not going down as much, but think about it. This is over, looking at a 50-year time frame here, and your operating funds are staying, they're going down very slightly, but it doesn't cost less to operate your housing as time goes on. So you're essentially getting less money just because that's going down. Capital needs is straight out going down. We have been reducing funding in capital, program capital grants, really since the 70s. And it doesn't, your property gets older, it doesn't become cheaper to operate and cheaper to repair. So I'm going to skip by the next couple slides because they just break down some of this, but I just wanted you to be aware, this is kind of the funding trends we're looking at, and this is why we're looking at trying to reposition housing into other funding streams that are more stable. So what I've done is, and I realize as I'm trying to be brief that I missed over a really important explanation, is the reason Section 8 can be a much more advantageous funding stream is the funding for Section 8 is under it's the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And the way they determine how much they pay for rents is based on a fair market rents for the area. In Brown County, the fair market rents are much higher than what you earn under public housing. You're only earning about 70%. Your public housing revenue is only at about 70% of what the fair market rents are. And so if you transitioned your housing over to project-based vouchers, then you would be earning revenue based on both the fair market rent and the rent comparability. So it's a two-part test. So the units would have to be comparable with other similar units in the market for the rent. But let's make some assumptions here. And this is your entire portfolio. So this is all 204 units. If we took Green Bay, both Mason Manor and the scattered sites, converted them from Section 9 public housing to Section 8 housing choice voucher with a project-based voucher assigned to all 202, 204 units, and we assume that you are earning rents at 100% of the FMR. So a voucher program can pay, they have a window on where they can set where they want to pay, between 90% and 110% of the FMR. I'm just going right in the middle at 100% and assuming that's what it is. So if we did that, this is a potential revenue stream you would see for all 204 units. So the way this calculation is being done is we're looking at the capital fund. So this is based on 2018 funding. So again, funding for public housing is at three-part: tenant rents, capital fund, operating fund. So this is the total amount for all 204 units. So in 2018, you earned about $1.4 million in public housing funding. If you converted all of your units over to vouchers and earned revenue based on 100% of the FMR, you would be getting rent revenue at about 1.7, 1.8 million. Essentially, you would be receiving $321,000 additional revenue each year. This is above and beyond what you're currently making. Because I'm, basically just taking, this is what you make now under Section 9, this is what you can make under Section 8, that's the addition. Yes?
Where does the tenant rent come in there?
Tenant rent would be the same thing. So this is actually basing that, so a one-bedroom, the rent would be $591, and essentially the tenant would pay 30% of their income, whatever that amounted to. So let's say 30% of their income was $300. They would pay $300, and then Section 8 would
just
pay the
in
other
there.
$291. Yeah, so it's
Okay,
built
gotcha.
into this.
Okay.
Kind of, and I didn't go a lot into detail, but that actually, it's kind of an interesting thing. Under public housing, we do not have, you cannot say that there's a number for rent. So like under Housing Choice Voucher, we can say a one-bedroom, the rent is $591. If you ask Stephanie or Jamie what the rent is on a one-bedroom at Mason Manor, they could not tell you. There is no rent
Oh.
for that, because the rent for each unit is based on 30% of that tenant's income, and then whatever you happen to get allocated in capital and operating fund for that year, which changes. So that means like, you could come up with a number. Stephanie could like figure out that for our one-bedroom, our number is X, but it would just be a made-up number.
Sure.
There's not like, you don't have like a rent schedule that says our one bedrooms are 500, our two bedrooms are 600. That doesn't exist in public housing, where it does in Housing Choice Voucher. And that's why we kind of have to do that PUM thing, where we figure out that average, because we don't really have a set number that you could say our rents are X for this.
So the tenants pay 30% of their income. Nothing changes for
Yeah,
the tenant.
yeah.
The difference is our subsidy from the government's larger.
Yes.
Depending what program.
And your subsidy would come from a different place
Comes
too,
from a
which I
different
kind
place,
of
and it's a
get over
larger
to.
amount.
Yeah.
That's
So-
the difference.
Well,
between the two.
but this would be my question, is if the fair market value is not what they're being based on now of their 30% income, correct?
No,
And now-
but their 30% is based on their income.
On their income.
And
So
we're,
their actual payment to you guys, like, so let's say everybody, we did all of Mason Manor into this, their rent won't go up.
Correct.
Okay. that's
yeah,
what-
yeah, so the tenant, the standard that the tenant falls under for what they pay, that's federally mandated at 30% of their adjusted gross income. And that standard is the same for Section 8 and Section 9. So the tenant does not, the only thing the tenant may change is, so they have to fill out like their form, like we call it a 50058. That would change, because Green Bay Housing Authority, as you're all aware, does not have a voucher program.
Right.
So if you transition to a project-based voucher program, your vouchers would actually get assigned probably to Brown County. So they would work with Brown County on their income calculations, but they would still pay their rent payment to Green Bay Housing Authority.
So and
We're like the landlord then.
fair,
in that.
your fair market rent numbers are based on Green Bay as a whole, or
Actually, Brown
Brown
County.
Brown County as a whole, period, how does it
Yep.
reflect on our average?
Well,
They're a lot
the-
higher.
That's a
Bro-
lot higher.
Yes. the
Yeah,
Brown
yeah,
County is a
and
higher
I kind of, I
amount.
said it quick, so you may not
Yeah.
have caught it, but
No,
right now,
I knew it
about
was
your
a-
revenue is about 70% of FMR.
But we could say that we want that 110%. Because you go up to 110%.
You could, so
correct?
when you
We could request
negotiate,
that.
yeah, when you negotiate your HAP contract with whoever holds your vouchers, which for our discussion, we're assuming would probably be Brown County.
Right.
You could negotiate that you want the HAP at 110%. Quite frankly, most private developers that enter into HAP contracts with housing authorities pretty much demand 110% and get it. But it's a two-factor test. So just because the FMR allows you to go up to that 110% doesn't mean you can get 110, because there's a rent comparability too.
Yeah.
So the housing authority has to go out and evaluate the units to say,
Right.
okay, a unit in Mason Manor, a one-bedroom unit, if we were gonna take this and look at comparable private, so basically it's like an appraisal. And they would say, well, okay, you may want $591 for your unit at Mason Manor, but when we look at the market in Green Bay, it's really only worth $580. So potentially you could earn less. And again, those are things that, at this point, I can't do that type of
Right.
review. It's a little bit, so I'm just taking what you're eligible for, taking the what's in the middle of that range, and basing my projections on that, just to show you what's available. But honestly, because you're at 70% of FMR, and on the Housing Choice Voucher side, the minimum they can go is 90%. Even if you had to come in at the bare minimum of what the FMR is for the voucher program, you would still be getting additional revenue.
Okay, and Section 18 was the path where we would take it out of federally owned, trust-managed.
That's one of the paths, yes.
And then who owns it?
You would have, the city of Green Bay, well, the Green Bay Housing
Green Bay
Authority would own
Housing
it.
The housing authority assumes the ownership.
Yes.
Okay.
Would we have to create like a nonprofit LLC?
Yeah, and again, that's kind of the details I'm skipping over a little bit, but if you went the Section 18 route, because the way that law is written, the title of that law is Section 18 Demolition or Disposition. And so demolition is, if you would just destroy the units, and obviously we're not proposing that, but you would be looking at the disposition. That's a fancy way of saying transfer of ownership. So if you did do a Section 18, you would have to create a wholly owned nonprofit corporation to take the ownership. It could still be completely owned by the Green Bay Housing Authority. It's a separate legal entity, so that technically we meet the legal definition of a transfer of ownership that's required under Section 18. RAD, on the other hand, you do not have to do that. RAD has special authorities that allow you to do that transfer and never have to create that other separate entity. However, if you're looking at doing tax credit financing, which is probably what you would be your first option to look at for any of these things, tax credit's going to require you to create a third-party entity anyway. So you're probably going to have to do that in any strategy that you would look at doing.
So that would make a separate board from the commission, or the commission would be the board that oversees the 501c3?
It can be set up in different ways, but the best way would be that this board would be that board.
Okay.
You could set it up, and there's just special wording, because you don't want really to have two separate boards.
No.
Because you can
Correct.
create a
That's
very
what I was
bad
wondering.
disconnect.
You and Stephanie's correct. You can do that, and really this is outside of HUD's range because that is all under state law. So you're organized as a housing authority under the state of Wisconsin, not under the United States government. And so any of these other things are going to be state incorporated entities. You're incorporating under the state of Wisconsin, so you would want to talk with your attorney on that. But just in my experience from working with other housing authorities that have done this, usually all the names are the same. It's just, they're two separate legal entities. They have two different tax ID numbers, but the board's the same, all the people are the same. It's just different things.
That's exactly what I was thinking. What would be the risk of the board?
Probably minimal.
And again, I can't, that's not something.
Those are my favorite terms ever, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's because it would be a nonprofit corporation, and I'm putting my lawyer hat on now, so, because it's a nonprofit entity, whether it's a corporation or an LLC or something like that, there's limited liability to it, so it would be no different from a board standpoint than what we face now.
Okay,
So,
that's
there's
right.
the liability. It's different than a public, or than a private corporation or business where there is liability that runs to the board. And you get insurance to cover it, but with a nonprofit, you still want some
Right.
insurance, some errors
Yeah,
and
we
omissions,
still-
but yeah, you're protected.
Okay, and so this I'm just looking at, this would be the whole portfolio, but as I'll get to, I do have a proposed strategy that I'm gonna present to you. And you wouldn't be taking your entire portfolio through the Section 18 removal. Most likely it would just be AMP2, which is your scattered sites, because again, I said, there's a really low barrier if you have scattered site units. Basically, that is what you have to be able to show in order to qualify for a Section 18 scattered site removal. And so if you just took your 50 units, currently you only have 48 because 2 of them were removed through the eminent domain. So if you took 50 units out of Section 9 public housing through a Section 18 removal, transition them over to voucher assistance, project-based that voucher, just on those 50 units alone, you would recognize about $154,000 in additional revenue. You are at 110% of fair market rent. It goes up to about $220,000 if they would qualify for 110% of FMR. So that's a substantial amount of additional revenue annually on just 50 units. If you're looking at just Mason Manor, it's about 164. So really, on 154 units, you actually earn almost as much additional revenue on just those 50 units as you would compared to Mason Manor. And the reason is because those scattered sites are larger units. You're talking 3 and 4 bedroom units, so those rents are considerably higher than what you're getting under public housing. So I think I talked about my potential strategy. So what I talked about earlier with just Bill and the Housing Authority staff is, so Mason Manor doesn't qualify for any of the additional flexibilities under Section 18 removal. So Mason Manor basically has to hit that really high cost barrier. And I think it would be difficult for Mason Manor to hit that, even if we're talking about all of the significant capital needs that Mason Manor has. And the reason is that that cost standard, it's called a total development cost. And essentially what it says is, because this was always looking at trying to preserve public housing, it was like, okay, if you want to remove it, then how much is it going to cost to replace it? And essentially, the standard is, looking at Mason Manor as it is now, how much would it cost to build that exact same building in 2019 dollars to the same to the standards that are there now? So whatever that number is, you have to show that your capital needs are over 67 or 63.7% of whatever that total development costs in order to qualify for Section 18. That is a really, really high cost barrier. Now, we have not run those numbers yet. I am just making some assumptions based on my previous experience and what I know. But most likely, it would be very difficult for Mason Manor to qualify for a Section 18 removal. There are other options. RAD is still available, and also that mixed finance that I talked about. So just making an assumption that Mason Manor wouldn't qualify for Section 18, the repositioning strategy that I'm briefly outlining here calls for a two-phase repositioning. The scattered site, which I've said multiple times, is a pretty easy bar to get over because your scattered site, you basically meet it. So you would move the scattered site 50 units over to a Section 8 PPV contract under the Section 18 removal. That's something that could happen fairly rapidly. You could probably get that from start to finish by the end of this year, calendar year. So by December, you could conceivably have those repositioned over into a Section 8 contract. And so the first stage is that conversion of AMP2, which is a scattered site. So you'd use the scattered site definition, you receive those higher revenues, and then that HAP contract that would go on there for the PBV, that's a 20-year contract. So you would still have protection and subsidy on those 50 units for 20 years. And HAP contracts are renewable. So even at the end of 20 years, again, Brown County would probably be the housing authority that would take the vouchers. Your other option is WIDA. You're lucky here because you have two housing authorities with jurisdiction. So you could even renew that HAP contract after 20 years. Yes, sir, you had a question?
What is the replacement value cost based on? Is it exclusively construction and whose dollar?
Are you talking about like with
Well,
under
the
that
63
TDC?
point something percent threshold that you'd have to hit.
That would be for Mason
So,
Manor.
and I may have Paul, who is our engineer, who happens to be in the office, detail that, but I think we use
That's just hard cost of
Yeah.
construction, you're talking about,
So
not soft costs?
Not soft costs at all, not fixtures. I mean, I'm not.
well, fixtures, yeah, but not, so when we're talking soft costs would be like developer fee,
Right.
and those kind of things.
I mean, honest truth is, I'm not sure that that building doesn't need 65% of the replacement cost to get it up and running. I'm like, I wouldn't
And it
confidently
may.
say in either direction without having that evaluated, because
And that's something you
She's
need,
coming
that's
higher
something you
than us,
need to
yeah.
evaluate. So we can come up, because it's the Swift and, what do we use for our cost basis?
RS means?
Yeah, RS means, so it's basically the industry standard costs. It's essentially, it's the same things that insurance companies use, like when they're
Right.
trying to determine a value for damages. We use, that's what we use to determine what that TDC cost is, the total development cost. And Paul, who is our engineer for HUD, can work with Green Bay on like what that is. So again, like I said, I'm making an assumption.
Sure.
Because it's been a high barrier
Yeah.
that.
And so can I
that-
just, the Broadway Lofts development, which is the new construction, that's like 93 apartments, and that cost is 17.6 million.
Right, so the Broadway.
Just to roughly estimate.
The Broadway lofts are stick framed. Mason Manor's a full-on concrete poured-in-place building.
Right, but I guess if you'd have to look at replacing that, right?
Yeah,
those
no,
costs.
but I mean, it's like in-kind versus, you know,
Mhm.
Yeah.
it's not, that's not.
Just to give you a
building.
gauge of-
Understood.
Yeah, no, and that being said, I mean, if Mason Manor could meet the total development cost, transitioning over through a Section 18 is probably your best option, because you're immediately getting higher revenue. And if you remember from that earlier slide when I was talking about RAD keeps your revenue the same. So essentially, if you used a RAD repositioning strategy for Mason Manor, you do not get an additional $165,000 in revenue. You basically, your revenue, it transitions over to a different type of revenue, but it's at the same level. So it's worth doing the calculation, but
So it's better to actually do, if we could get, if it was 63%, that would.
you want to know what your number is that you're trying to
Right,
hit, yeah.
Okay.
So again, so I'm making some assumptions based on, not you know, I'm not a developer and I'm not digging into the weeds on this because that's your job as a housing authority. So I'm just making the assumption based on previous experience because honestly, we've had numerous housing authorities try to meet the Section 18 total development standard, and none of them have done it in the last 5 years that I've been working with housing authorities in Wisconsin. So it is a high barrier. I'm sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, just a quick question on the first stage. Let's say we did that, would we have to become a 501c3 before?
Before it actually closed, because there would be a sale, there would be that disposition, so there would have to be somebody to
So we'd have
receive,
to-
We need
yeah,
to
to
create
receive the
that
housing.
Before we
actually
closing.
would start it, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm just talking, like, when I was talking the time frame, like, this could be done by December, I'm only thinking about how,
Sure.
like, what our requirements are on our side.
Right.
You would have to, obviously, as a board, evaluate, you know, what things you would have to have together. And so the first stage would be essentially the scattered site removal through Section 18. The second stage, we've got two options. So, and option one is just doing a RAD conversion, but then option two is actually doing a mixed finance rehab, where Mason Manor would actually stay in public housing and it would do that mixed finance. And that's an option that's been available to you this entire time. I think it is probably, I would recommend that you take a look at it. I mean, if you qualify or are awarded 9% tax credits, a mixed finance is actually a really good way to do that. And in a future, you know, the next slide, I think I'm going to talk about why it may be advantageous for you to keep Mason Manor in public housing at least for, you know, 5 or 6 more years. So the stage one, the AMP2 scattered site conversion, so you convert it over to a PPP contract. And again, this 218,000 number here, that's based on 110%. So if you were able to get 110% of the FMR, you're looking at an additional 218,000 annually. And like I mentioned, under the Section 18, because you're getting that under a HAP contract, the minute you get that money, it's the housing authorities to use how you want. So you don't, it's not tied. You don't have to use all that 218,000 only for the scattered site. If you wanted to use it for other things that the housing authority is doing, that's money, revenue that's available to the housing authority to use as you see fit. Vouchers are assigned again either to Brown County or WEDA. Probably be Brown County. I think, you know, they're local, be a little bit easier to work with, but you know, unlike many other areas of Wisconsin, you actually have 2 housing authorities with jurisdiction, so you get the option. And then you're no longer responsible for all those administrative burdens. So that's Brown County's problem, you know, and all the HUD requirements that are tied to vouchers, Brown County's the one that's got to be.
That was going to be my next question. So then you're not having to do the renews every year
No.
for those
REAC
ICS
inspections.
woods. Yes,
Yep.
yes, all of that.
All of that is on Brown,
All of it.
all that's on Brown County. Now, if they wanted to, they could contract with you to do that.
Well,
Here,
because I
don't
was
think
just
it
going to
makes
say,
sense.
do they have the staff?
Well, they have
Okay.
a contractor that does many of that, and they do have the
Okay,
staff to do that,
okay.
so.
Well, and I think importantly, and this is a question I asked too, is that, you know, we have this pool of vouchers available in Brown
Correct.
County. This does not pull from that pool.
Correct.
actually
It just
do.
adds, it brings more
Adds
in.
additional vouchers in,
Correct.
which is good, because, you know, I don't want to pull from that pool that we have.
Well,
existing.
yeah, and from
So
what
the
you were
waiting list for
saying,
that.
when it was project-based versus tenant-based, so that,
Mhm.
so I got that. But it was just, so if they're contracting with that, whoever they're contracting with, that's another 50 units. So that's a lot of reviews every year, as you know.
Yeah, it's actually,
So is that another
uh,
staff person that's coming in, you know, so just, you know, knowing that the work
They would
that
have to
they're
be,
gonna have
they would have to be
yes.
aware of it. Honestly, I
Correct.
don't think it's actually gonna be that big, because Brown
Okay.
County actually has a.
We have a large
Yeah,
voucher.
Brown County has got a
population.
ton of
Yes.
vouchers, so 50
Yes.
extra is
Yeah.
kind
And
of a
then-
drop in the bucket for them.
But it still adds
But
on
it's
to
still
staff.
50 additional, it's still
Yes.
50 additional
Yes.
inspections,
Yes.
50 additional.
Yep, that's
Did-
exactly
reviews.
right.
But then Brown County would also get the additional admin
Yes.
fee for
Yeah.
that, so they would get more money to
Yeah.
pay for that other stuff.
And that's
So-
what I'm wondering,
So
so
they
how
would
that
get
would all
more
work.
money to handle
Okay.
that.
Yeah,
And
because
that's
there
fine.
is, each voucher has an admin fee. I don't know what it is offhand for
Sure.
Brown County, but it's probably about $50 to $60. And so they would earn, you know, $50 to $60 per month for each voucher that's leased. So that would essentially be the money, if they did need to hire additional staff, they would have additional funding to be able to do that.
Okay, that's what was, you know, yeah.
And so when we're talking about doing the Section 18 removal for the scattered site, this is, we're coming to the big reason on why it's advantageous to leave Mason Manor in public housing for potentially up to another 5 years. So again, I've said this a few times, but like Section 18 removals, the standard HUD always looks at is we're trying to preserve housing. We're trying to keep housing preserved. To do that, when we do a removal, there's this thing called a DDTF. So what a DDTF is a demolition, disposition, transition funding. Because again, we're HUD, we use acronyms for everything. And what that does is it says, okay, you removed 50 units from your public housing. We are going to continue your capital funding like those 50 units are still in your portfolio for another 5 years. The idea being that you would use that money to redevelop new units to replace them. But in this case, you're not really getting rid of those units, you're just moving them to a different subsidy. So essentially, you have capital funding for the next 5 years coming in. Now, that capital funding, it has all the same strings attached to it that any other capital funding has, so it can only be used for public housing. So going back to our cost chart, oops, sorry. As of 2018 numbers, you earn $109,000 a year in capital funding. So just assuming that it stays at that level, which is a really big assumption because we saw the trend lines, I mean, it probably will go down, but just to make it easy for math in my head when I'm talking to you, we'll just say that it stays at about 100,000. That means you are getting about 500,000 in additional capital fund revenue over the next 5 years. Now, it comes in at about 100,000 a year, so it's not like you get a check for 500 right off the bat, but that's additional 100,000 every year that can be used for Mason Manor. Because it's capital funds, so it has to be used for public housing. And if you remove the scattered site, the only public housing you have left is Mason Manor. So if you converted Mason Manor over right away, you're essentially giving up that additional 500,000 in revenue. Now, depending on what the capital needs are, 500,000 may not be enough to hit it. You may want to convert it earlier, but you need to be aware that if you do convert it, so let's say the AMP2 scattered sites leave at the end of 2019. So that would be 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, you would get 100,000 extra. And so for those years, you would be getting that extra capital funding.
So the capital funding then, if we move scattered sites over to project-based vouchers, as the housing authority, we're responsible to maintain these units, keep them upgraded and whatnot. The capital funds for that then just comes from the rent we receive, the difference. That's something the housing authority manages then, the HAP payment. There's no other capital funds coming from.
No, okay, I'm sorry, yeah, I lost track with where, yeah, so when in the converted units, the HAP payment comes in, but it's not divided between like operating or capital,
Okay.
whatever. You just get, you know,
We
you get
just get this-
30% of the rent is paid
Yep.
for by the tenants, you know, whatever their income level is, and then that whatever above and beyond 30% of their income is in the HAP payment, and you can use that for whatever. If you wanted to use 100% of it for capital, you could. If you wanted to use 100% of it for
Right.
operating funds, you could do that too.
Well, our
But there's
scattered
no
sites
strings attached to it.
Need improvements as
Yes.
well. You know,
Well, and one of the other advantages
So-
with this is once you convert your scattered sites, they're now your property. We remove that declaration of trust, they're the housing authority's property. If you want to sell them, sell them. Now, if you have project-based contract assigned to that housing, so let's say you convert all 50 of these units and you get a project-based contract for all 50, you are committed to Brown County to provide 50 units of housing, because you have a HAP contract with
So if
them.
we sell them, we
So-
have to pick up another.
You got it, you're back.
But we have but it's easy, you know, some of the units we might want to circle out and change locations or for
Correct.
whatever reason.
Oh, absolutely,
Concentration
yes,
and stuff like
that.
Possible
absolutely.
incentivizing the quality of your
These,
current
oh,
scattered
yes.
sites, right? So if they
Right.
were all like pristine and shiny and perfect, then 500 sounds awesome. And if they're
Exactly.
not, they're,
But,
right,
but it
so-
doesn't mean you have to hold on to them and take all of this extra money you're getting and pour it back into it, because
Right.
you're
Right, so
getting,
that's, where's the curve?
you're getting almost
You know,
enough
that-
additional revenue each year just on that AMPS removal to maybe buy a single-family home. That's kind of a little bit on the low end if we're talking a 3 or 4 bedroom, but, you know, essentially, you're pretty close to just being able to outright buy single-family homes that are on the market. And even if the house that you're selling is in very, very poor condition, and I know most of your houses aren't, because they get inspecting now, so they're, you know, they're actually
Yeah,
not
yeah.
like
Right.
horrible housing,
Right,
they're still
right. They're just-
livable.
they're
They're
dated.
dated, they've got
Yep.
things, they're not, you know, they may not be ones you want to keep in your portfolio, but think about it, you sell that housing, you're going to get revenue from the sale of the house, whatever it is, plus
Yeah.
you have an additional, so even if you just said, okay, we're going to replace one house a year, because we know we get an additional 150,000 every year, we'll just use that to buy a new house, and then was, you know, so you kind of
Yeah.
essentially improve your portfolio by
I mean,
gradually.
even 60% that goes back into maintaining,
Right.
you're still up 40%, right?
Well, and we do have the flex, depending how we work with Brown County on this, we could possibly do homeownership incentives as well,
I
right?
was just gonna
Yeah.
say that.
I mean, that's a
would be
possibility for us,
something
maybe we say
For the
10
project
units.
base,
Are you
yes.
jumping ahead?
We have a
Isn't that
family
jumping
that-
ahead?
No, he had mentioned that earlier, so I was.
Yeah,
gonna bring
Brown
that up.
County, well, you have.
We have the.
You have home ownership under public
yes.
housing. You could do what's called a Section 32 home ownership, which essentially, if you keep the scattered sites in the public housing, you actually have the ability to develop a home ownership plan to just sell those properties in public housing.
Sure.
But Brown County, under their voucher program, already
Has the
a voucher
yeah.
home ownership
Yeah.
program. So if you converted these 50 units over, Brown County could say, you know what? This is a great opportunity for us to ramp up our home ownership program that we already have and take these people that have vouchers and see if any of them want to become
Want to
homeowners.
become homeowners, yeah, because one of the big things is finding the property that could be available at a price that
Yep.
is.
Right.
And for you, that would still be a sale. So even if you wanted to,
Right.
and now I'm making some assumptions, and obviously these are things that you as the board need to decide, but even if you wanted to say, you know what, we're willing to take losses on these homes because we're making homeowners out of our previous participants, you're still going to get revenue from a sale
Correct.
that you can turn around to buy a new home.
Right.
So, I mean, it opens up a lot more options.
It gives us
because
flexibility, that's the
there-
difference.
Exactly. You own the property, not the federal government. Because when it's under the declaration of trust under public housing, because of the way the law is written, you are very restrictive on what you can do on that house.
We learned.
Yeah.
We went through what, I mean, we had a property condemned, right, for the right of way?
Yeah.
And it was condemned, like, it wasn't even a voluntary, that took 9 months, 10 months?
Yes.
I mean, it was just to get that property out of there, but,
Yeah.
yeah, it was great.
And you couldn't do any, I mean, and like, because
So
it
it
was in
just
public
allows
housing, you were
us
stuck with, you couldn't do anything.
greater
with it, so.
flexibility on the properties.
Yeah.
Right, yep.
Um, Yeah, and so again, as I mentioned, so you get that DDTF, so then again, that's kind of like an extra 500,000 over 5 years that's just added on top.
Just quick question on that, we do this, we do a 501c3, can we do both, can we be both boards?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, a 501c3.
It's an LLC.
Yeah, that's right.
Is it an LLC?
Well,
It doesn't make any difference.
Doesn't make a difference either way.
So
The-
we
the
can
only-
still be the commission for Mason Manor and
Yes.
be the
Yes.
board for
Mhm.
the nonprofit.
Just
Okay.
remember to bring both hats.
Yeah.
The only wrinkle on that, and I probably should be deferring to the attorney in the room, but if you got tax credit financing, you'd actually have to create a for-profit company because in order for there to be tax credits for a company to earn, there has to be
We might
a
have to
tax
have-
basis.
We might have to have a nonprofit and a for-profit, the
All in
LLC.
one.
Yeah.
No, they have to
No,
be
no,
separate.
They have to be
Oh.
separate.
We
If
go from
tax
one-
credit financing, if that's a route that the board went,
Okay.
We go from one board to.
Future.
Because we would make
Members
money.
of 3 boards.
there's a profit element.
Correct, yeah.
And in my judgment, being somebody that doesn't have to be on the board or deal with it at all, it's not super complicated, because we do have many very small housing authorities that have both a nonprofit and for-profit subsidiaries because they've done mixed finance, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Okay.
So Brilliant is a good example because it's fairly close to you. And, yeah.
No, you're fine, I have to be something.
You know, so Brilliant, you're talking about a 24-unit housing authority, and they have both a nonprofit and a for-profit subsidiary because they did tax credit. So I
Okay.
mean,
Okay.
they have very minimal staff, very minimal board, and they're able to do it.
So we're heading towards a slide that's going to show a little bit of all of these things to tailor to our. current-
Well, that's kind of what I'm going through here. I don't have like my big reveal was that money one previously that kind of showed that you get all that extra money if you go section 18. And so this is, so stage one on this one, talking about the scattered site, you get that extra, 100,000 per year for capital funds. So then stage two, this is where you've got different options. And so option one would be the RAD conversion. So you would convert it over to a section 8 type contract through RAD. The funding stays the same, because again, remember with RAD, the hope in RAD is to keep that funding the same. But it removes the DOT off the property, so you get more flexibility on what you want to do with the property. However, in RAD, there will be a restrictive covenant placed on the property. So it basically, almost in perpetuity, it's 30 years, but it's mandatory renewal. It essentially says that the property has to be operated as affordable housing unless HUD in the future waives that. So you're still kind of tied into having that property has to be affordable.
Sure.
But you own it, so now you get more options on financing. You can go either the PBV or the PBRA. But the problem with this, there's two problems with this, is if you go RAD, you're no longer in section 9, you're in section 8. So if you did it before that DDTF funding period runs out, if you did it before that 5-year period ran out, then essentially, you have to understand that the decision you're making is you're giving up whatever future DDTF funds may be out there. So what my recommendation, and I didn't really put it in writing, is you would go RAD. RAD is definitely a more difficult process to go through, because again, RAD was developed about 10 years ago before some of these other flexibilities got put into law. So this was kind of like a way to navigate through the existing laws at the time to come up with a repositioning strategy. So it's not, it's typically a 2 to 3 year process to go through. So you could start it before, 2024, but, understand that you're not going to get to the end point of conversion into RAD until like 2024, 2025. So that way you kind of get the best of both worlds. You got the conversion going through, but you're still maximizing the time period when you're earning the DDTF. The second option is do the mixed finance rehab. So you can do mixed finance rehab now. You could have done mixed finance rehab, basically, I think mixed finance rehabs came about in like mid-90s. So I mean, you've had this option for decades. But it keeps you in Section 9 public housing, but it's a special maneuver that allows you to get funding from specific federal sources. So that issue where you don't own the housing isn't as much of a problem, because basically the funding's coming from the federal government anyway, so we don't, the security of the property isn't as much of a concern. So basically, the two main options you would get under mixed finance is either low-income housing tax credit or home funds. So home, that's the Federal Home Loan Bank, and for the Midwest, that bank is in Chicago. They have specific products available for financing rehab of public housing. But again, I mean, you're kind of limited to those two things, and if your tax credit application isn't successful, then you're kind of stuck with only having the home as an option. So you're restricted, but it's still an option. And like I said, I've been using Brilliant a couple of times as an example. That's what Brilliant did. They're still public housing. They did both tax credit and home financing in order to do a mixed finance rehab, and they did that back in 2008. So it is an option. The advantage of doing the mixed finance rehab option is it keeps it in Section 9, so you don't have to worry about that DDTF thing. So you would be eligible to be earning that DDTF, and unlike the RAD where you may have to wait 4 or 5 years before you get access to that additional financing, you could potentially get financing to meet your capital needs right now. Because as was discussed, and we were having a conversation with David, there are lots of capital needs that may not be able to wait until 2023, 2024, and an additional 100,000 or even 200,000 if you combine the money from the scattered sites may not be enough to hit those needs, so you may not be able to wait that long. So the option 2 provides that option. Ms. Jimmy.
For Berlin, how many units were they?
There are 24 units of public housing.
So do you know roughly how much they received for low-income housing?
I don't remember what their low-income housing,
Yeah,
but they were able to rehab the whole unit.
Yeah, okay.
And they actually have they're quadplexes, so they're multiple different buildings. So they're even though it's 24 units, it's a little bit more expensive to operate because they have they have a lot of buildings. So
Does Mason Manor have to stay as a whole?
yeah, on any of these, it would be very difficult to try to do partial removal because essentially it's 1 amp. So we would have to do a 2-step process. So an amp is an asset management. Boy, I don't even remember what the P stands for.
Management project?
Project, yeah, I think so. So essentially, that's like our term that we use to identify a single project of public housing. And right now, Mason Manor is what we call AMP 1. So in order, if you wanted to do a partial building, we would have to first make 2 amps. We'd have to divide that into multiple amps. And then, the makeup of Mason Manor doesn't make it easy to do. So Wausau did a RAD. So Wausau has successfully gone through RAD, and they removed, and they actually did that. But the way they were able to do it is they have a 2-tower building.
So they severed one tower.
But it's essentially
yeah.
one building, because you've got 1 tower, and then, got 1 tower here, 1 tower here, but the common area, the offices and everything was like one, in between. So technically it was one structure.
Yeah.
And they basically said, we're gonna make 1 amp, 2 amps that, it's always easy to do. Mason Manor, it would be tough to,
floors.
You'd have to go
yeah,
horizontally.
it would be really tough.
Or we would have to employ some infrastructure to be able to
Yeah,
separate the 2 buildings, right? Like put a 2-hour barrier right down the middle.
yeah. So the easiest way would just be.
Different elevators.
Well, we're close
Right.
anyway, though, because the units themselves are separated. So,
Right.
I mean, some of that math might be there depending
On
on.
the community room and the
Yeah.
entrance.
But if all of the math is based on units and all of our problems are infrastructure, right? So if it's, these 3 floors are condos, and these, whatever floors are rentable, and the transition to fix the infrastructure that serves both of those. I mean, it seems like, but yeah, right on. So that's a big pain in the butt.
And these are the discussions that you as the board need to be making, because all I'm doing right now is telling you what your options are available under the new things. But no, and that's good thinking. I'm not, that's exactly what you need to be thinking about, because it's not my job to come up with your strategy. This is just based on what's available to you right now. This is, I think I spent about a whole 3 hours on this, which is not anywhere near the amount of time to come up with a fleshed out redevelopment plan for a housing authority as big as Green Bay. But I just wanted to provide an example of what one of the options are. So this is basically, I'm at the end now of the, what I was presenting, but so it gives you, some options. And some of those options essentially do provide you with much higher revenue stream. That being said, I did want to add something in, and and I forgot to mention this when we had our meeting beforehand, but not anecdotally, but if you're thinking about doing these items, any of these redevelopment, right now is a good time to do this. Because, and I don't remember if I said it in this meeting or a pre-meeting, but what's happened with funding, so this is just the capital fund, you can see the trend line is going down, but there's like one glaring thing on here that is probably sticking out to everybody, and that's that dot that's way the heck up here, and that was actually last year's funding. This chart only goes through 2018. If we would add 2019, that dot would be right next to it up there. Essentially, that's congressional dysfunction. So Congress has had essentially an agreement to lower domestic funding by a certain percentage just about every year since the 2012 sequester, and that's where you see a lot of this kind of thing where it went down below your trend line. That's when sequester happened. Well, when Congress couldn't figure out, between Congress and the administration, when they couldn't figure out the budget last year, essentially all of that agreement got thrown out the window, and they just funded it at what you should have been funded at if that agreement hadn't been made in 2012. And then this year, under the budget confusion and lack of understanding or lack of agreement that they had, they basically just did what's called a continuing resolution and said, this is how much we spent last year, we're just going to tack it onto this year. The reason I'm going into this is because if you reposition now, you're locking in, especially on RAD's side, because remember, RAD keeps your funding level. The sooner you do RAD, you lock in the higher. Because if this all of a sudden goes back down to here, well then in the future you lock yourself down at a lower rate. And RAD resets what your rent levels are every 2 years. So right now we're under a 2018 set. So RAD stays like it is for the next 2 years. You get locked in at whatever the RAD rents are when you file your application and you get what's called a CHAP, which is essentially the agreement that you can do RAD. It's not when you come out the other end. It's when you come in the door for RAD is when you get locked in. And so right now, we're at higher levels. So just so you're aware, you don't want to wait years and years and years. And if you remember right from my strategy, some of that did have you waiting for years.
Right.
This option one. But it was years from when you came out the other side, not when you walked in the door. So,
Not from the application.
yeah, because you get set when you, not necessarily when you file the application, because you do have to do some steps, but there's a thing called a CHAP.
Okay.
And the CHAP, and I don't remember what that acronym is, but basically it's like,
Commitment to housing assistance payment.
there you go. Basically, it's the commitment, that's the key word. The HUD has committed to saying, yeah, you've met, your right application looks like it would get approved. We're committing to enter into a HAP contract with you when we get to the other side of the HAP application process.
We can go through this process without actually committing. We can start that
You
application
can
process.
actually get to the point of even having a CHAP and then withdraw. You can, the only point that you cannot.
We can lock in that high bullet
Yep.
regardless of the decision we make from
Mhm.
a commissioner standpoint.
Just remember that you're committing yourself to doing work and costs, because once you start the RAD process,
That's what I was gonna
there
say.
are costs that you will have to
A lot of
have,
work.
and so those will be lost costs if you don't,
Some of
Complete.
it's facility analysis that we need.
that you're gonna have to do.
Right.
Right. I mean, like, we're gonna have those costs
Yeah.
with or without it.
Yep.
Okay. This is super helpful for me. It's got super
Okay.
great presentation.
And I,
Oh, go ahead.
Are you done?
Nope, I'm done. I was just gonna
Okay.
say, if you've got any future questions, you can contact me,
just wanted
Jamie, and Cheryl have my contact information, so.
Great.
Not a very good host there, because I forgot to mention we have representatives from Superior. And I just wanted to do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Scott?
I can ask them offline. Oh, I've got a couple of questions, but that's all right.
Okay. All right.
Did you
very
just want
good.
me to turn off the TV? or-
Oh,
Thank you for the opportunity to Appreciate you coming here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again, Scott. That was great. So we are now on to item.
Okay, can I just get a little direction though,
Yes.
from the board? I know we're working on, and it was good information from Scott with regards to that capital improvements plan. So we're going to continue,
Sorry,
do you need an agenda?
she needs to
I
get on
can- yeah.
the log in and join.
Oh, to vote, that's right.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out how to get in, so.
Can we do a voice vote for you?
I was gonna
Good,
say,
all
if you want to do
right,
voice vote,
I
that's okay.
can, all right.
Nice meeting you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
So after this presentation now, we got some direction with regards to what kind of plan we need for capital improvements plan. Because we didn't know, well, do we need to get the full loan for this grant? And actually Scott told us, no, don't spend a lot of money on that capital improvements plan, just get what you need to find out the cost for this.
Thank you.
Don't do the extra environmental.
Sure, that makes sense, yeah.
Or concise, but kind of.
No, it was great, thanks.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Scott.
Scott.
So we're gonna continue to get that now that we have some direction on how to get that capital improvements plan and what we need to get that done. My question is there anything else you want us to do within the next month? I guess one thing I'd like to do is I'd like to meet with the Brown County Housing Authority
Yes.
and talk to them about the project-based vouchers.
Good idea.
Yep, their thoughts on that and,
Yeah.
just kind of an
And
informal meeting.
I would also start exploring the possibility of setting up that subsidiary nonprofit.
Okay.
We can do that.
I wanted to talk to Brody and find out what they did for the 501c3 or the.
The thing with the thing with the.
We need to hire an attorney to do that, right?
Yeah. Well, but the thing is with the 501c3, that may take a while.
That's a government IRS process.
That's an IRS process. Now, I've done some, or been involved, I do it's an accounting
Right,
exercise.
right.
But I've been involved with some that, we filed one for the library up in Egg Harbor on an expedited, it was a short
Oh,
form.
yep.
And it took them like 6 weeks and we got it.
Yeah.
I'm doing another project with some folks that are doing a nonprofit and I set up an educational foundation. And it's been with the IRS for almost a year.
Yeah.
And it's cost us about $30,000 in legal and accounting fees.
Well, that's what, yes.
So that's.
So I don't know if a
mean,
501c3 is the right route. We
Well,
probably-
you need to go 501c3 or some 501c something or other, because there's different variations of it, in order to become tax exempt.
Okay, so to form an LLC, you need to be a 501c3 or C4?
No, you need
No.
to, I can do a 501, or I can do an LLC or a corporation this afternoon.
We need
Okay.
a not-for-profit
But-
entity to receive the
Right,
ownership
so
of the building.
You've got to set up the nonprofit entity, so if it's a corporation or an LLC, you've got to set that up first, and then, once that's recognized by the state, so that's a state deal, you register it with the state. Once that's registered and certified with the state, then you can apply to the IRS for that entity to be recognized as tax exempt. And so, and people misunderstand this sometimes, when you organize that LLC or nonprofit corporation, you get a tax ID number.
Right.
That's not
Right.
there's no such thing as a tax exempt number.
Right.
It's our tax.
When you get your tax ID number, once the IRS says you're exempt,
calls it
that
tax
tax
exempt.
ID number goes onto a list that the IRS has that says that this entity is now tax exempt under
Right.
whatever provision. So, but the next step would be to look at organizing an LLC or a corporation, whichever, it doesn't make any difference. It couldn't be an property, it could be an LLC, but probably
That's
better
a-
off as a corporation.
Right.
But again, that's something that needs to be explored, to have somebody do that.
Okay, so
That's, yeah, because.
we're gonna meet with we're gonna meet with the executive director of the BCHA. We're gonna work on that capital needs plan for Mason Manor. We have it for our scattered sites already. And then we need to work with our city attorney, I think,
Yeah.
maybe, to
Somebody in
find
our
out.
office could do that.
Okay,
If not, have them call me and I can help them all with it too.
okay.
And that would be on a 501,
Well, it's just a-
whatever, or
well,
50?
one-
The vehicle you need to receive real estate,
Right.
right? Because they have to, they're gonna, basically HUD is going to say, you're gonna own this
Yeah,
property,
so
we're gonna deed this to
your-
the. whatever.
if you talk to Brilliant, see if you can get a copy of their documents, because when you organize the corporation or whatever, in the bylaws, it has to have certain language in there in order to make it eligible for which 501, whatever.
Oh,
yeah.
gotcha.
So-
line.
As far as Brilliant goes, I would be super thrilled to see an example of a similar size municipality that has gone this route, and I don't know if that's.
Is Appleton County?
I mean.
Which
it-
route?
Well, I like.
Like the
Wausau.
red
Is
route?
there a
Wausau
Green
probably.
Bay size municipality that has some amount of housing authority that went red or section?
Wausau.
Wausau.
Okay.
Went there.
What,
That
yeah.
list.
I don't know about like Racine or Kenosha or.
They're way bigger
Than ours.
Well, they're not with their largest, but,
for housing authority.
no, like for
Oh,
municipalities.
yeah.
Milwaukee's done a lot of them,
Okay.
right? It's my
Yeah.
understanding.
Mhm.
What information are you looking for?
Well, I'm just
from-
like, it just, I don't know, it's a little overwhelming, I guess, right? Like, what happens? What are the?
That's, what are the ramifications, what are the liabilities, what are the, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Like, has it
Not
ever
necessarily
gone sour
ramifications,
for
but
anybody
liabilities, yeah.
nationally? And how'd it go sour, right? That seems like a pretty reasonable answer, fair question. The other thing is, if it's, I mean, his figures in here, $164,000 a year, $30 million a year, 150. How much, like, are we even gonna get to what we need to do with the amount of income we're talking about, right? So,
Well, I guess it's two different angles, right? I look at the scattered site, to me, that's kind of a no-brainer. Because if
I was
you can
thinking
get
the same
those on
thing.
the project-based vouchers,
Mhm.
just to free us up with the flexibility, when Stephanie goes through capital improvements, she's got this much for roof, this much for carpet, this much.
Oh,
And if
yeah.
something breaks, then to be able to just take that
Absolutely.
same amount of money and meet the needs. To me, that's kind of an easy one, the scattered site. The Mason Manor is a different animal, because until we know how much we're going to have to put into it, maybe we don't go rad. Maybe we
Right.
go with that
And
section
finance.
finance, and we apply for low-income tax credits ourselves or whatever to do those improvements.
yeah.
So I think we're down the road for Mason Manor, unfortunately, not too far, because we've got to make those improvements like we did.
From a historical perspective, it seems to me, my recollection, and I may be entirely wrong with this, but it looked, for some reason, it seemed to me that back some years ago, back when Keith Pampern was involved, we looked at scattered sites going to Section 8, and there was some reason why we didn't do it, and I don't know what that reason
Yeah.
is.
It sounds like like HUD is making it easier to do that.
But it's
Yes, it
making
could
it a
be
lot
that the rules
That's
have
the
easier,
changed.
difference.
because then the new notice came out in 2018,
Yeah.
so last
Oh,
year
That could
where.
be it. That could be it. But yeah, there was some
So-
reason, and maybe that they wouldn't give up their trust position on it, that might have been it,
And I think,
Or maybe they were pulling it from the pool.
yeah.
They weren't allocating new vouchers, they were actually pulling it from your existing pool, and the BCHA would be like, why would I do that, take 200 vouchers away from my existing pool?
but the 2000, so what I read of the 2008 notice is prior to then, each property had to meet that 63 point odd percentage
Oh.
of that. But now,
Yeah,
if
he-
you're
he made a
scattered sites,
comment
if you're
that
4 or
lowered-
less
they
units
lowered the
per,
threshold.
you're automatic.
Yeah, they just say automatic.
You're automatic,
That
yeah.
probably was right. Yeah,
So it was a
63%.
You had to meet the 63% of the, for
So
each,
for
for
each
each
unit.
one, but
Sure.
now they put a stipulation in there, are you 4 or less per unit? Yes, automatically, yeah.
Okay.
That you can reposition.
So you know what you need to look for
Yes,
next month.
yes.
Okay.
BCHA,
But I still-
Kathleen.
Still look at see if you can get the information from Brilliant on what
Yep.
they did, because that's gonna track through no matter
Right.
what size it is, it's gonna be the same form. So if they got it filed and approved, that's the template to use. Because, again, the IRS will look for patterns, and if they've approved it once before, they're gonna approve it again, and we can make reference to that in the application, so that it speeds it up, even if you don't go the short form
Right.
application, if you go the regular one, if you can point to a similar one that you're following their template, it'll speed it up.
I'm just like, in general, as we started this conversation, you and I had a little, gosh, this feels too good to be true sort of notion. And like the tagline on the end of the thing was like, and if you buy now, and I'm like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, right?
Well, I did bring that up when we had the other meeting, that this, he started off saying the administration is taking a position that they'd like to see, housing authorities reposition, and here's
Okay,
Dr.
right.
Ben coming up with an idea, but, and I mentioned to him, this RAD stuff has been around for a while, and he mentioned it again here before, that it's been out there for about 10, 12 years now.
Right.
And he said that when you sign that HAP contract, you're locked in for 20 years. So even if the rules change, you're already under contract that's been approved by HUD and been approved by the parties to the contract. So for at least 20 years, they can't all of a sudden undercut you and say, well, now you're
You don't get caught holding the bag again,
Right.
Correct.
at least till 20 years in a day.
Which is
Right.
different because we don't have really a 20-year contract that ties
So,
us into a number right now.
How
Yeah.
does,
It's
what
whatever
happens,
Congress gives us.
what happens right now? These are federally owned properties, and if the bottom fell out, or we stopped existing like we do,
I think
what
it's-
happens?
They would, they would take the properties back. They're technically their properties,
Mhm.
and we have no authority. If we ever wanted to not go this route, the property would have to be, no money, no federal money would be able to go into that property for 20 years before that DOT would ever drop off.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it would be, I think what you're saying too, it's a no-brainer for me, also for the scattered sites, but I think we really need to think.
We
Different
kind of went
information.
through that a little bit when we were discussing with the Brown County situation
Mhm,
about
mhm.
merging or whatever.
Yep.
And that was one of the issues that we ran up against, is that, there was some push by some people to say, get rid of all that. We
Mhm.
can't.
Right.
We're in a program that we're locked into.
City can't sell it
We
because
can't,
the city doesn't
yes,
own
because
it.
Right.
nobody.
Right. So we can't be compelled to get rid of it. Even if they got rid of the housing authority, it would still stay.
Yeah.
HUD would
That's
still
public.
own public housing.
Right.
So is there any vote that needs to be taken right now on this, or is this just
No, this is-
informational?
I think
And they're
we're
gonna come back
instructing
next
staff.
week?
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta keep going, I apologize. I got
Problem.
another thing
Right.
at noon.
Any other questions on this item, or are we ready to move on?
See you next one.
Next one. All right, so next item on the agenda is consideration with possible action on passbook savings rate.
Steph is going to handle that.
Okay. The passbook savings rate is currently set at 0%, and what that is it's actually something that deals with the tenants. If they have assets that are greater than $5,000, we are supposed to apply this rate to their assets, and then that amount would be considered income and go towards their 30%. So historically, it has been at 0%. We can be 75 basis points either above or below what the national rate is. And the national rate is at 0.06%. So we could go up 75 basis points, or we could leave it there, or we could move it to 0. I don't think, Jamie, there's not many people that this would apply to at Mason Manor or scattered sites with this.
It would affect all accounts.
No, but-
Accounts that wouldn't have already passed, it's like a savings account, or a rate of interest. This would affect every account that doesn't have a
Okay.
rate of interest.
Um,
Historic, right now, it's at 0.
Yep, so this could affect everyone if we raise this or increase this. I thought it was just on assets, I'm sorry, Dave. So I would just say our recommendation would to remain at 0. I really don't,
Yeah.
'cause it's-
Yeah. All right, I will make that motion that we leave the passbook savings rate at 0% for the time being.
I would second that all day.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any other questions, discussion? Otherwise, we are ready to vote.
I'm sorry, I have one question. Do you even have a sense as if it's worth looking into more? I mean, that's what.
Into this?
Yeah.
it would just be more revenue that we would get from the tenants and then less operating subsidy we would get from HUD. It would be a wash.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a motion, and there's a second, so go ahead and vote.
Okay, motion was approved.
All right,
Moving on to item number 2, consideration with possible action to approve GBHA scattered site gutter cleaning contract.
All right, in a nutshell, remember I came back and I gave you the whole story about we need to do it twice this year. We're looking for a 5 contract. It shouldn't exceed $2,500 a year. It did. So that's why I'm back. Got 2 bids.
Like, why are we talking about this again?
3,000. I'm glad you said that. Because, so we have 2 bids. One was at a little over 3,000, one was at 9,900.
Wow, that's a
3,000, that's a big jump, so I'm just asking for approval to go with the $3,000.
I will make a motion to go with the lowest responsible bidder at $3,000.
I'll second that.
A motion and a second. Any further questions or discussion? Otherwise, we are ready to vote.
10 grand. That's a, I don't want to clean your gutters number, that's what that is.
Just wait till you see the report. Okay, motion approved.
All right. We've done number 3 already, so we'll go on to number 4. Consideration of possible action to change the GBHA purchase approval thresholds to be consistent with that of the City of Green Bay guidelines.
So speaking about these small contracts I'm bringing back to the GBHA, I don't know how long it's been, but ever since I can remember, contracts of 2,000 or more come to the GBHA for approval. I don't know why that is. If you look at it, and I put in your packet, there's like the financial approval authority for like the City of Green Bay stuff. So in my role as assistant director for this department, I have the approval to authorize up to $10,000 in contracts. And then our management staff, like step below me, they have up to $5,000 before that needs to come back to a committee.
Okay.
Now, the process stays the same. We either quote it, we bid it. It's not
Right.
like we change how that happens. But as far as this board having to make those approvals, what I'm asking is that this be consistent with what the city's plan is, and that as the executive director, for example, I could have signed that scattered site contract.
Ask us for about $532.
Exactly. So I'm asking for myself for up to $10,000 and for Jamie as a manager to be up to $5,000 to make those approvals. Now, that being said, there are contracts that may be less than that that we want to take to the board for approval that are out of the normal realm of, you know, like this RAD stuff, for example.
When the city does it under their policy, do they ever give to the finance committee or something an update of, well, you know, these are the contracts that were under that 5,000 or 10,000 that we approved, so that they at least kind of know what you're approving?
I think they do. Actually, I think it was just raised for finance committee up to $25,000
Okay.
for department heads. But, so I'm not sure. I think at the beginning of the meeting, they kind of do like, this is what was done, and I'd have no problem doing that at the
Yeah,
beginning of
as
it.
long
Just
as-
reporting out that these were the contracts that were
As far
executed.
as I'm concerned, we could raise that threshold. I'd be thrilled if you could include bullet points in the director's report later.
Oh,
Yeah.
like, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you do it, we still like to know.
You're right.
Yep,
Right.
mhm, yep, I agree.
And it just
So-
makes sense to me, and with, be consistent with the city of Green Bay. I mean,
Well, there's
You wonder
numbers you
why
can
that-
do for $2,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay, so I will make a motion that we revise the GBHA purchase approval thresholds to be consistent with that of the City of Green Bay guidelines, now or in the future. So if the Green Bay changes their guidelines, we'll follow that.
I'll second that.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further questions or discussion? Otherwise, we are ready to vote.
Motion approved.
So this is really working well today.
All right, let's see, number 5, consideration with possible action on approval of GBHA operating budget and budget resolution number 19-2 for fiscal year beginning July 1, 2019.
Stephanie's going to handle that.
So, in the information that was given to you, there was a whole list of background and highlights. I'll just go over a couple of those. Central office cost center, we're decreasing by $20,000 because we're not doing a 6th floor renovation again. Mason Manor, we are up in some areas. There's some snow equipment that they need to replace. The estimated cost is $12,500 for a salter, a drop salter, the plow blade, and skid forks. So that's all.
Didn't we just buy a new snowblower?
We purchased, no, we purchased the skid steer, but we also have the truck and we need a new push blade on that and the salter on the truck.
Yep. And then the skid forks would be to either put that salter on or take it off.
Sure.
So that is one of the increases. Tenant services, the contract is going up 14,000. This is due to increase from Spectrum. We pay for certain things for them, and the billing has just gone up.
Cable for tenants.
Cable, Wi-Fi,
Mhm.
in the computer room.
Mhm.
So, and then maintenance supplies, due to growing needs, there is an increase for 42,000 and 27,000 respectively for supplies and contracts.
And those are for like the minor maintenance types of things, not contracts that we're putting out, in other words.
Do we need to do anything with the budget for these other things that we just got done talking about? We're gonna have some expenses for the,
Attorney, probably.
well, yeah, and for the
Capital.
capital improvements
Mhm.
study. So is there
I
something
think
that we
what would
may?
we look
It
at?
was in there, but I don't know where it was put. Fire protection, maintenance contract.
Are we gonna use the unrestricted dollars for that?
That, and maybe,
I knew we needed the capital improvement, but although it sounds like we'll be able to get that done for probably less than 5,000.
Okay, so where did I get that? Miscellaneous.
The,
Oh.
the more.
Okay. Other general expenditures increased by $20,000 to cover the cost of capital needs assessment. Sorry, I didn't read down far enough on that one, so we do have that in.
Okay.
The more continued maintenance we do on that piece of property before we do the evaluation relative to that 63-point-something% higher, it's gonna be a hit.
Which is the discussion we have all the time.
Right, I bet, yeah.
With regards to
You put a
Mason
new
Manor.
roof on there, and then you don't have to, right, then you can't count needing to replace the roof, as you know, I mean, like, you're whittling, I mean, you have to in some capacity.
All right, so any further questions regarding the
You've set up my next
budget?
agenda item twice now.
All right, sorry.
That's okay.
So are there any other questions? Does anyone have any concerns?
So I will make a motion to approve. Is there a second? We're talking- Okay, we're talking about the budget for beginning July 1 this year. All right, so there is a motion, a second. Any further questions for Stephanie?
I have one. Looking at, and then I don't know where this fell in here, but training needs.
Training needs, yes.
Tell me about Happy Training.
That is the software that our tenants.
We go out every Friday night.
Between 4
Old-fashioned.
PM and 6 PM. Did you bring Hot Ma along?
That is the tenants, the tenant database that we use, that is all of Jamie's.
called Happy.
It's called Happy.
Yeah.
Okay,
Happy software.
Yeah, Happy software.
cool. I thought, what the heck?
You have to have happy training for your happy software. All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, we are ready to vote.
Motion approved.
All right, moving on to item number 6. Consideration with possible action on approval of Mason Manor roof mechanical maintenance and repairs to Kirkman Mechanical for $8,460 and Mason Manor Mason Manor roof maintenance repair to Northern Metal and Roofing for $32,585.
Okay, so the roof at Mason Manor probably should just get replaced at this point, which would be a very large cost. But what we're trying to do is make the repairs so we can stop the leaking until we know what we're actually going to do with Mason Manor. So we've got 2 separate contracts here. Let me back up. I did authorize an emergency repair. It was, I think, $1,900 because there were some pinholes in the roof that was causing some water leakage. I think hopefully the water stopped from that.
It did.
Okay. So up there on top of Mason Manor, we have 2 HVAC units that are insulated, and they've got ceiling on them. So we need to replace, and the birds peck at them, and the ceiling is cracked or whatnot. So we have a contract to come in and replace that insulation around those HVAC units and to seal the area around there. That's the first one with Herkman Mechanical and AMA. That one is $8,460 was the low bidder. And then we have the actual repair of the floor, the actual roof flat surface, which is going to be the flashing on that roof and just kind of
Holes.
right, it's cracked its old holes. So that is going to get us through until we can replace it. That bid actually was quite different. That was Northern Metal and Roofing was the low bidder for $32,585. We had another bid for $102,001. Wow. Which was a big difference. So what we'd like to do is make repairs to the roof to make sure that it doesn't leak anymore, Herkman and with Northern.
And I don't know if we can do this with this, do we need separate votes on this, or just one vote?
I don't know if we do. I combined them because it's you're approving both contracts, but
They're two
it's not a
different-
resolution.
Yeah,
But
they're two different things, so maybe we should do two.
you can
votes.
break them up. You can break
Yeah,
them
let's
up.
do two votes with them, okay.
Okay.
So I will make a motion to approve the first one for Herkman,
Mhm.
for, what is it, $8,460.
Mhm.
Is there a second?
Oh, go ahead, please.
Second.
We have a second, all right. So
I'll make a motion for Northern Metal and Roofing for.
All right, we'll do that when we get to this
Oh,
one.
yeah,
done
no, we
first.
can't. Double. Yeah, right on.
All right, so we're voting on the first one. Come on.
The first one is approved.
All right, so the second one,
Yeah, wait, actually, you know, just because I'm staring at it. We're confident that Northern doesn't have re-insulation and sealing of the mechanical system
Yep.
for Hardman's.
Yes.
And did anybody reach out to the other guys to figure out why they had 3 times the bid?
You know, we let Public Works run this
Okay.
bid process.
Right on. Yeah.
And we have a memo from both of them saying they're confident that the lower bidder succeeded. You know, we were at that bid opening and there were a number, just on other
Yeah.
Public Works projects that were,
Yeah, right on.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure if some people just want to bid to stay in the loop, but
right.
don't want the
right.
job.
I've
but,
seen that in other
um,
municipalities too, you get.
It's crazy.
You know,
Yeah.
double.
A courtesy bid, sure, but not 3 times.
Well, that's
Very well.
actually not, I don't think that's out of the ordinary from what Public Works has seen on projects.
Cool.
So we got a
Yeah,
motion?
yeah, I'll make a motion to
Is
approve it.
there a second?
Second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second on the Northern Metal and Roofing for $32,585. Any further discussion? Otherwise, we are right to vote. Okay.
Motion passed.
Moving on to item number 7, consideration with possible action on Mason Manor parking lease addendum.
Yes, so staff has created a new parking addendum. Currently, Mason Manor has all assigned parking spaces. It does not limit people from still parking in parking spots that are not theirs. So we have purchased parking passes. So now they'll have to put it on their rear mirror, and with the parking passes, we can have the Department of Public Works Parking Division monitor our parking lot 24 hours, 7 days a week, and issue parking passes.
Parking
Tickets.
Tickets, excuse me, thank you. Way too many parking things. So now they can issue parking tickets to those violators, and we have also put up the correct signs that we need at all entrances saying that we are a permitted parking area.
So what happens if I have a spot and I have my little sticker on my window or
Mhm.
whatever, and I go to my spot and somebody else is in it? Would I have to come to the office and say, you've got a violator?
That's
what happens right now.
That's what happens now, probably 10, 15 times a week.
Would you have a spot, or do you just have your,
You have us, right now, there are assigned spots.
with your new, what you're suggesting?
Both. So
Both,
they're gonna continue
okay.
to have their assigned spot. We do not have anything that is in, their
You can't-
car
you
or
can't really
parking.
enforce it in any
Correct.
capacity.
Yeah.
Now they're gonna have a tag along with it, so if they don't have that tag and they're in somebody's spot, you can send somebody else.
And a lot of them are tenants or visitors from Admiral Court properties
Sure.
parking there and walking up,
Yep.
or visitors, so they won't have the parking pass to park in the wrong numbered spot.
Okay. And will there be signage with this?
It's already up.
Okay, very good. Right, well, I'll make a motion to
It's not
approve the
really up
addendum.
until the board approves this.
Right.
It's not up.
Well, I'll second.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion or questions? Otherwise, we are ready to vote.
Thank you.
All right, see you guys.
Yes.
Hanging on by the skin of our teeth.
Dropping the
Nobody else go
flies.
down.
All right,
Motion approved.
all right, moving on to informational, GBHA bills.
Those were sent out. Are there any questions on any of them?
I have none.
Okay.
Do you need a motion to approve or?
No,
All
they're all
right.
informational.
All right,
Um,
ready to move on to the GBHA financial report?
Yes, that was also sent out. If there is no questions on the regular one, I would like to point out there's a CFP one on there.
Yes.
And under that, we did receive our 2019 funding, which is $330,432 for the 2019 year. We haven't designated, because I have to get together with Jamie and David to find out how we're going to allocate it, but that is the amount that we received for 2019. So it
Is
is.
that the little blip that he was talking about?
That was actually, 18 was up. We're up about 10,000 more than we got last year, which is up 120,000 from a previous year.
Okay.
So-
Very good.
So the dot that he said, well, it's not on there, but it will be right next to it.
That's it?
Yep.
Okay. Very good. All right, moving on to Langen report. Do we have any questions regarding the Langen report? I didn't have any, but. All right. Then we'll move on to the director's report.
So as I mentioned before, I did authorize an emergency repair for $1,900 to secure roofing, which I think they solved the problem for the roof leaking. We had a successful tenant event. We had the spring fling at Mason Manor with the resident advisory board, set it up and actually worked it, put it together very well, I thought, with tenants. We also have a new veterans display in the front window area that I think a tenant worked on setting that up as well. And then we are working with Lutheran Social Services, who is our coordinator right now for our service coordinator, but we received that Ross grant. And Lutheran Social Services has agreed to work with us on administering the Ross grant. There's a lot of reporting involved with that. So we're going to execute a contract with them just to have the Ross grant cover those admin costs. So, yeah, that's it.
All right, number 5, occupancy report for the month of April 2019.
That is also in your packet. The last couple months, we've had really tough months of between 8 and 10 people moving out, but we continue to truck along. And Mason Manor, we're still maintaining a 30-day turnaround. So scattered sites, we've been taking on a little bit more projects because these tenants have resided in our properties much longer. So we are starting to remodel using our CFP dollars. So the time frame is going up slightly, but we are still maintaining and doing a very good job.
Any questions? Back here. Let's see, occupancy report we just did, so date of next meeting, June 20th. That's it.
That's it.
Thank you all very much.
We have the motion to adjourn.
So let's move on to item F. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Oh, I would make it.
All right, we have a motion. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. Thank you again very much.